When people hear my name on a poster or marquee, they probably expect stories about outlaws, gunfights, or tough guys staring down danger in some dusty old town. That's fair. I built a career on that kind of grit. But tonight isn't about Hollywood or the movies. It's not about the characters I've played or the awards sitting on some shelf collecting dust. This one's personal. It's about something that happened to me, a night that changed the way I look at everything. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Clint Eastwood talking about faith? Yeah, it surprised me too. I've always been a practical man, the kind who believes in what he can see and touch. I've lived long enough to know there's a lot in this world you can't explain, but that doesn't mean you stop asking questions. I've seen the sun rise over deserts, the waves crash along the Pacific, and I've watched people fight for things they believe in. But what I'm about to tell you isn't about what I've seen out there, it's about what I saw inside. I didn't plan for it. It wasn't part of some movie script or publicity stunt. It came one quiet night, long after the cameras had stopped rolling, when life slows down and you start to think about what really matters. I was an old man sitting alone with the sound of the ocean in the distance, the same rhythm that's rocked me to sleep for decades. There's something about that sound, steady, eternal, that reminds you how small you really are. I went to bed that night expecting nothing more than rest, but what came instead was more vivid, more real than anything I could have shot on film. Sometimes in life, you hit a moment that slices through the noise, that makes you stop pretending you've got it all figured out. For me, that night was one of those moments. It wasn't a dream, not the way we usually think of dreams. It felt too clear, too grounded, and it wasn't about me being anyone's hero. It was about being humbled, about being reminded that there's more to this life than what we build, buy, or conquer. It's funny, you spend a lifetime directing other people's stories, and then one night, the author of everything decides to hand you a scene of your own, one you'll never forget. So if you came here expecting a speech about movies or memories, you might be in for something different. This isn't about fame or fortune. It's about a moment of truth that shook me awake. And maybe, just maybe, it'll do the same for you. I've lived a long life, longer than I ever expected. 90-some years on this earth will teach a man a few things, mostly about what matters and what doesn't. I've seen the world from more angles than I can count. I've stood on movie sets, under blazing desert suns, watched heroes rise and fall on screen and off, and shaken hands with presidents, soldiers, cowboys, and dreamers. I've told stories about courage and redemption, justice and mercy, men doing the right thing when it would have been easier to walk away. But for all that I've witnessed, the wars, the fame, the history and motion, nothing prepared me for what came next. You see, there comes a point in a man's life when he's done chasing applause, when the noise quiets down and the soul starts whispering louder than the crowd. That's when you begin to realize that the trophies, the headlines, even the victories aren't the whole story. They're just the surface. The real stuff, the part that matters, happens in silence when no one's watching. I've been called a lot of things in my time: tough, stoic, stubborn. Maybe there's some truth in that. But beneath all that grit, I've always been a student of people, watching them, studying what makes them tick. I've seen how fear can harden a man's heart, how pride can blind him, and how love, when it finally breaks through, can heal what years of pain could not. Life has a way of humbling you, whether you're ready or not. It strips away your illusions until you're left standing there with just yourself, your faith, and your questions. And I've had plenty of those. Sometimes I think back to the beginning, that young kid from San Francisco who just wanted to make his mark, to prove something to the world. I thought success would give me peace, but it didn't. I thought understanding life would come with age, but it didn't. You don't outgrow your questions, you just start asking better ones. And the biggest one, the one that's haunted me lately, is what it all adds up to. What's it all for? What are we supposed to learn after walking this long road? I used to think I had the answers, but the truth is, I didn't. None of my films, None of the accolades, none of the years behind a camera could prepare me for the moment when the curtain lifted on something bigger than me, something that made all the rest feel small. You think you've seen it all until the day you realize you've only been watching shadows. That's the night my story really began. It was one of those quiet September evenings in Carmel when the world feels settled, when even the ocean seems to breathe slower. I'd spent the day out on the ranch, working with my hands, feeling the kind of tired that comes from sweat and sun, not screens and meetings. There's a peace in that kind of exhaustion. Your body aches, but your mind clears. The air that night was cool, the kind of crispness that whispers of fall coming in from the sea. I had a simple dinner, grilled chicken, a few vegetables from the garden, and a glass of water, nothing fancy. At my age, simplicity becomes a luxury. You stop needing much to be content. I turned in early, around 9, with the windows open wide. The ocean was out there, somewhere in the dark, its rhythm steady and eternal. I've fallen asleep to that sound for decades. It's the closest thing I know to a lullaby for an old soul. That night, it seemed to carry a different kind of weight, as if the waves themselves were waiting for something. I remember lying there, half between waking and sleep, thinking about the way the world changes, how fame fades, how friends pass on, how time humbles even the strongest of us. The moonlight spilled across the floor like silver paint, and for the first time in a long while I felt small, not lost, just aware. Aware that no matter how much ground you've covered in life, there are still roads you haven't walked, mysteries you haven't touched. I drifted off with that thought in my mind, expecting the usual restless sleep that comes with age. But this was different. The moment I closed my eyes, it was as if I'd crossed into another world, one clearer, sharper, more alive than anything I'd ever dreamed before. Dreams usually jump and scatter, but this one didn't. It had focus, purpose. Every sound, every color, every breath of air felt real enough to touch. I found myself standing in the open desert beneath a sky painted gold by the setting sun. The air was still too still, and the silence wasn't empty. It was full, almost sacred, like the pause before a symphony begins. I could feel the earth under my boots, smell the dry wind, see the horizon stretching out forever. And somewhere deep down I knew something was coming. You don't always get warnings in life, but you can feel when the world is about to speak. That night, the universe wasn't whispering, it was holding its breath. And as I stood in that golden light, not yet knowing why I was there or what waited ahead, I could sense it. Something bigger than me was about to walk into the frame. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that feels alive, like the whole world is listening. I was standing in a desert that looked like Nevada or Arizona, somewhere I'd filmed 100 times before, but this was different. The sky stretched wide and endless, painted in shades of gold and amber as the sun sank low. The air was still, not a whisper of wind, and the ground beneath my boots felt warm, solid, almost sacred. Everything around me glowed with that late afternoon light, the kind that turns even the roughest landscape into something holy. It didn't feel like a dream. It felt like I'd stepped behind the curtain of reality into a place more real than the one I'd left behind. Every shadow had meaning. Every grain of sand seemed to hum with life. I could smell the earth, dry and honest, like time itself had stopped to let me take it all in. I stood there a while, trying to make sense of it. I wasn't scared, but I wasn't calm either. It was that quiet awe you feel standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon or watching your first child being born when you know you're witnessing something far beyond you. Then, out of the fading light, I saw a figure. At first he was just a shape in the distance, standing still about 30 feet away. But before I could think or question, something deep inside me already knew who he was. It wasn't reason, it wasn't recognition, it was knowing, pure and undeniable. Jesus. Not the painted figure from Sunday school, not the solemn man in stained glass, but someone real, someone alive. He wasn't wearing robes or glowing with light. He wore jeans, a work shirt, boots worn from the road. His hands looked like they'd built things, like they knew the weight of a hammer and the ache of labor. His face, weathered but timeless, held strength and gentleness in equal measure, but it was his eyes that stopped me cold, dark, steady, infinite. When he looked at me, it felt like he saw everything, every sin, every scar, every mercy I'd ever shown, and loved me all the same. There was no judgment in his gaze, only understanding. The kind of understanding that strips away all your defenses until you're just human again. He started walking toward me, slow and deliberate, and though I should have been trembling, I wasn't. I couldn't move, not from fear, but from a strange peace that held me there. When he was close enough for me to see the lines on his face, he smiled a small, knowing smile that said, "It's all right. You're exactly where you need to be." And in that moment, standing under that endless sky, I realized something. I wasn't dreaming. I was being called. He stood there in the fading light, not 10 yards away, and I could see him clearly now. Not a ghost, not some glowing figure out of a painting, but a man. A man who looked like he'd lived, worked, and carried the weight of the world without ever letting it break him. His clothes were simple, a faded work shirt, jeans worn thin at the knees, and a pair of scuffed boots that had seen their share of dust and miles. His hands caught my eye, first strong, calloused, the kind that knew how to build things, to fix what was broken. I thought, of course, the carpenter. It made perfect sense. He didn't look like a king or a preacher. He looked like someone you might pass on a ranch road, nod to, and somehow feel better for having seen. But his face, that's what stayed with me. Weathered, yet somehow ageless. The kind of face that's seen both joy and sorrow and learned not to flinch at either. There were lines, sure, but they weren't signs of age. They were maps of compassion, of understanding. And his eyes. I've spent a lifetime directing actors, watching faces under lights, searching for truth in every frame. But I'd never seen eyes like that. They were dark and deep, steady and kind. When he looked at me, it wasn't like being watched, it was like being known. Every moment of my life, every success, every failure, every time I'd stood tall or fallen short, it was all there in his gaze. And the strange thing was, there wasn't a trace of judgment, only love. Not the kind you earn, but the kind that's given freely, just because you exist. For a moment, I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. There was something in that stillness that felt eternal, like time itself had stopped to let me breathe in that presence. My heart wasn't racing, it was steady, calm, quiet, like it finally found its rhythm after years of rushing. I thought about all the times in my life I'd tried to be strong, to be the man who didn't blink, didn't break. And now, standing in front of him, I realized real strength wasn't about never bending. It was about love, the kind that sees everything you are and still says, "You're worth saving." He smiled then, just a small one, soft and knowing. It wasn't the grin of a performer or the warmth of a friend. It was something deeper, older. It said, "I know you're confused, but it's all right. You're exactly where you're supposed to be." And in that desert light, with the world holding its breath, I understood that I wasn't just seeing a man. I was standing in the presence of grace itself. He looked at me with that steady, knowing gaze, and when he spoke my name, Clint, it wasn't loud, but it carried more power than any voice I'd ever heard. It was calm, certain, the way truth sounds when it doesn't need to prove itself. Hearing him say my name did something to me. I've been called Mr. Eastwood, director, legend, icon, all those fancy titles people throw around in this business, but none of them ever hit like that. It wasn't the voice of a stranger. It was the voice of someone who'd known me all my life, even in the moments I tried to forget myself. He said, "I've come to tell you something about America." I didn't move, didn't speak. I just listened, because when the Son of God decides to talk to you, you don't interrupt. He paused a moment, like he was giving me a chance to breathe, to absorb what was coming. Then he said, "I know what you're thinking. Why you? Why now? You've doubted, you've questioned. You've made peace with the mystery of not knowing. But I never needed your perfection, Clint. I just need your voice. That hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent a lifetime trying to get things right on set, in life, in the way I told stories, but here was Jesus telling me it wasn't about being perfect, it was about being willing. Willing to speak when it's easier to stay silent. Willing to stand when it's easier to sit out. He looked out over the horizon, and I followed his eyes. The sun was slipping behind the desert hills, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever. America, he said softly, almost like a prayer. Do you know what she was meant to be? I thought I did. Freedom, opportunity, the pursuit of happiness, all the ideals we wave around on holidays. But as I looked at him, I knew there was something deeper. America was meant to be a light, he continued. Not the only light, but a light nonetheless, a place where people could begin again, where mistakes could be forgiven, where character mattered more than circumstance. His words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot, clear, heavy, and impossible to ignore. I felt small standing there, not because he made me feel unworthy, but because his vision of America was so much larger than ours. It wasn't political, it wasn't patriotic theater, it was spiritual. It was about who we are when no one's watching, about whether we still believe in mercy and second chances, in loving our neighbor even when they don't look or think like us. He turned back to me and said, You've told stories about redemption your whole life. Now I'm asking you to live one. Tell them what you've seen, Clint. Remind them of who they were meant to be. And in that moment I realized he wasn't just talking to me, he was talking through me. He turned back toward me, and there was a sadness in his eyes, the kind that only comes from watching something once beautiful lose its way. America, he said softly, as if speaking the word carried both pride and pain. She was meant to be a light. His voice didn't thunder, it carried the quiet conviction of truth. Not the only light, he continued, but a light nonetheless, a place where people could begin again, where forgiveness wasn't weakness but courage, where every soul had dignity, and where no one's worth depended on their past. I listened, and the weight of those words pressed down on me. I'd grown up believing in that America, the land of second chances, of men who could make mistakes and still find redemption. It was the America I tried to capture in my films, the weary lawman, the broken soldier, the outlaw who still had a spark of decency left in him. But somewhere along the road we traded that humility for something else. We became obsessed with being right, with winning, with pointing fingers instead of extending hands. He looked out across the horizon where the last streaks of sunlight were fading, and his voice softened even more. You were never meant to be perfect, he said, only willing to be better, to forgive, to grow, to remember that freedom isn't about doing whatever you want, it's about choosing what's right, even when it costs you. I felt those words cut through me because I knew how easily we forget that. We built a nation on the idea of grace, but we've become a people who struggle to give it. We've learned to shout louder, not listen deeper. We build walls faster than we build bridges. We label before we love. As he spoke, I thought about the America I'd seen over my lifetime, the farmers and builders, the dreamers and drifters, the families scraping by but still believing tomorrow would be better. They were the heartbeat of this country. And yet, somehow, we drifted from their spirit. You were meant to be a place where mercy outweighed judgment, he said, his tone firm now, where your strength came from compassion, not pride. But you've forgotten that light. You've let it dim under anger, greed, and fear. The wind picked up then, carrying the scent of dust and distance, and I felt the truth of it in my bones. Maybe that's why he came to remind us that the flame still burns, even when we've buried it under the noise. The light of America wasn't in her power or her politics. It was in her people, in their capacity to forgive, to rebuild, to choose love when hate was easier. That, he said finally, looking right through me, is what she was meant to be. And in that moment I knew he wasn't just talking about a nation, he was talking about all of us. He turned back to me with that look steady, patient, but carrying the weight of centuries. You've become divided, he said, his voice calm but unyielding. You've forgotten who you are. Those words hit harder than any sermon or speech I'd ever heard. Before you were Republican or Democrat, before you were conservative or liberal, before you were black or white, rich or poor, you were human. You were my children. He didn't have to raise his voice. The truth in it carried like thunder across a quiet canyon. I stood there, feeling the sting of it, because I knew he was right. I've seen it with my own eyes, the shouting, the name-calling, the walls we build not with bricks but with pride. We've turned disagreement into warfare, conviction into contempt. Somewhere along the line, we stopped seeing each other as people and started seeing enemies where there used to be neighbors. He started walking again, slow and steady across that desert floor, and I fell in beside him. You've made idols of your ideologies, he continued. You've taken your politics, your tribes, your fears, and you've built them into altars. You no longer seek truth, you seek victory. You no longer ask to understand. You demand to be right. I thought about the world I'd watched evolve, screens glowing late into the night, each one spitting out outrage and certainty, everyone so sure their side holds all the answers. We've mistaken volume for virtue. We've traded compassion for the thrill of being right. And while we fight, the real enemy, hate, fear, division, sits back and grins. He looked over at me then, and there was no anger in his face, only sorrow. I came to teach love, he said. Not tolerance. Love. The kind that listens. The kind that forgives. The kind that reaches across the divide and says, "You're still my brother." I felt the words settle deep, like an echo in a canyon that keeps rolling long after the sound fades. He wasn't talking about politics, he was talking about the human heart. We've let our differences become gods, our pride become our flag, but pride doesn't heal wounds, only love does. I thought about all the years I'd spent telling stories about heroes and villains, right and wrong, justice and vengeance, but standing there beside him, I realized the real battle wasn't out there. It was in us in every choice, to love or hate, to listen or to turn away. He stopped, looked straight ahead, and said quietly, "You've forgotten how to love, Clint. But love is the only thing that ever changed the world." And right then, under that endless desert sky, I believed him. He stopped walking and turned toward me, the last light of the sun catching his face. "You know," he said, "when I walked the earth, I told people to love their enemies." His tone was steady, almost tender, but the weight behind it felt like it could move mountains. Not to tolerate them, not to coexist with them, to love them. He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a challenge. "Do you have any idea how radical that still is?" I didn't answer, because deep down, I knew he wasn't looking for an answer. He was asking me to feel it, to face it. "It's easy to love the ones who agree with you," he said softly. "Anyone can do that, but love means crossing the line. It means listening when it hurts, forgiving when it's unfair, and showing mercy when the world tells you to fight back." I stood there thinking about all the times I'd chosen silence over compassion, pride over peace. I've seen what happens when men can't forgive. Wars start, families fall apart, hearts harden until nothing good can grow there anymore. We live in a time where people treat kindness like weakness, where being right has become more important than being good. But that night, looking into the eyes of the man who had every right to judge me and didn't, I understood something simple but hard to live by. Love isn't a feeling, it's a choice. And it's the hardest choice you'll ever make. He took a few steps forward, his boots crunching on the dry earth. "Change doesn't start with governments or movements," he said. "It starts with one person deciding to love when hate seems easier. One person choosing to forgive instead of getting even. One person looking at someone they disagree with and saying, 'You're still my brother.' That's where it begins. Always has." I thought about that, about all the people I'd crossed paths with, the stubborn, the proud, the broken, the angry. Maybe each of them was a chance to choose love, a test I didn't always pass. He looked out at the horizon, where the first stars were beginning to flicker awake. "You think this world is too far gone," he said quietly, "but it isn't. Love can still save it. It always could. And in that moment, I realized he wasn't talking about a soft kind of love, the greeting card kind. He was talking about a love that costs you something. The kind that asks you to swallow your pride, to carry someone else's pain, to forgive even when it doesn't make sense. That kind of love takes guts. It takes courage. It's the hardest thing a man can do, and the only thing that makes him truly free. And standing there in that desert twilight, I knew he was right, because the only real victory in this life is love. He looked out toward the horizon, where the last streaks of sunlight were fading behind the desert hills. The wind had picked up, stirring the dust, and his voice carried through it steady, calm, but with that deep gravity that settles right into your bones. America has done great things, he said. You've been a beacon of hope for millions. You've lifted up the broken, welcomed the lost, and dreamed bigger than any empire before you. I could see it in my mind, those moments of courage and compassion that defined us. The soldiers who gave their lives on foreign soil, the pioneers who built towns out of wilderness, the nurses who held dying hands in hospital tents, the artists who painted hope onto the walls of despair. You've created, built, sacrificed, he continued. You've sung songs that touched the world, written words that made strangers believe in freedom again. He smiled faintly, almost proud, and for a heartbeat I thought maybe the story ended there, America, the shining light. But then his expression changed. His eyes grew heavier, sadder. But you've done terrible things too, he said softly. You've enslaved your own brothers. You've broken promises to the people who first walked this land. You've chosen greed when you could have chosen grace. You've turned power into pride and freedom into a weapon. His words didn't come like accusations, they came like truth spoken from someone who loved too deeply to stay silent. Like every person, every nation, you hold both light and shadow. Great good and great evil live within your story. The question, he said, looking straight at me now, is which one you'll choose next. I felt that hit me like a gut punch. I thought about all I'd seen, the wars, the marches, the victories, the heartbreaks. America has always been a contradiction, a place where compassion and cruelty walk the same road. We built cathedrals to freedom while locking chains around wrists. We reached for the stars while forgetting to care for our neighbors. And yet, despite it all, the light never completely went out. Maybe that's what he was reminding me, that redemption is still possible, but it takes courage to face what's broken. The future, he said, his gaze returning to the dying sun, will be written not by your leaders but by your choices, by ordinary people deciding whether to build or destroy, to unite or divide. He took a step closer, his voice softer now. Will you let fear and anger dictate your story? Or will you remember what you were meant to be, a nation of grace, humility, and love? The desert fell silent again. I didn't have an answer, but I knew this much. The choice was ours and time was running short. He turned back to me, his eyes reflecting the last light of the desert sky, and there was a gentleness in them that words can't quite touch. Tell them, he said, that I love them, all of them, the strong and the weak, the certain and the lost, the believers and the doubters. Tell them that their worth isn't measured by power or wealth or victories, but by the simple truth that they are mine. His voice carried through the stillness like the wind before a storm, soft, yet full of something eternal. Tell them to put down their weapons, he continued, not just the ones made of steel and lead, but the ones made of words and pride. The weapons of contempt, of arrogance, of judgment. They've used them long enough. It's time to lay them down. I felt my chest tighten as he spoke, because I knew exactly what he meant. We've all drawn those invisible swords, cutting people down in our hearts, in our conversations, in the silence we give instead of understanding. Tell them to pick up the tools of peace, he said, of compassion and humility. To listen before they speak, to forgive before they condemn, to heal instead of wound. He smiled faintly, as if he knew how hard that would be for us. It's not weakness, he said. It's the only real strength there is. The air felt electric, alive, like every word he spoke was being carved into the marrow of time itself. And then he added, "Remind them that America's best days aren't behind her. They're still ahead, but only if she remembers what she was meant to be. Not perfect, but striving. Not proud, but humble. Not powerful, but good." The desert light was fading fast now. The stars were waking above us, scattered like promises across the sky. I wanted to hold on to the moment, to ask him 1,000 questions, but my voice was gone. He stepped closer, close enough for me to see the lines around his eyes, the marks of both laughter and sorrow. "Time is shorter than you think," he said. "Life is more fragile than you realize. All the noise, the arguments, the outrage will fade, but love endures forever." I felt something shift in the air, like a change in the tide. The colors began to dissolve, the gold, the blue, the horizon itself. He was becoming light, fading, but not disappearing, just returning to where light belongs. And then, as the desert dissolved around me, his voice came one last time, firm and full of peace. "Fear not, Clint. I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Then it was quiet again. I woke to the sound of the ocean outside my window, the moonlight spilling across the floor, and a warmth still resting on my shoulder like his hand had never left. When I woke, the room was quiet except for the sound of the ocean, steady and eternal beyond the window. The moonlight spilled across the floor like a silver trail, leading me back to where I'd been, but everything felt different. The air seemed charged with something unseen, something holy. My heart was still pounding, not from fear, but from awe. I sat up slowly, and I could still feel it, the warmth on my shoulder where his hand had rested. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't a dream fading into mist. It was real as the dawn that would soon break over the California coast. I looked at the clock, 2 a.m. I'd been asleep for 5 hours, but it felt like 5 minutes in eternity. I got out of bed, found a pen and paper, and began to write. Every word, every detail, every sound of that desert wind. I didn't stop until my hand cramped and the first light of morning touched the horizon. I knew I had to capture it before the world's noise came rushing back in, before doubt tried to steal what I'd been given. Since that night, not a day has passed that I haven't thought about what I saw, what I heard. I've wrestled with it, questioned it, even tried to reason it away. I'm not a preacher, never claimed to be. I'm just a man who spent his life telling stories. But this isn't fiction. This happened. And as much as I wanted to keep it to myself, to avoid the headlines and the whispers that come when an old man talks about visions, I couldn't. Because every time I thought of staying quiet, I felt that same warmth again, reminding me I am with you always. So here I am, telling you the truth as I lived it. What I learned that night wasn't about politics or power or which side wins the argument. It was about the heart. The real battles aren't fought in Washington or on the internet. They're fought inside each of us. Every time we choose hate over love, pride over grace, revenge over forgiveness. No law, no election, no leader can heal a soul hardened by anger. Only love can do that. Only grace can make us whole again. Maybe that sounds simple, but I've learned that the simplest truths are the hardest to live by. Love your neighbor, forgive your enemies, see people as human before you see them as anything else. That's where the healing starts, one person at a time, one act of kindness at a time. That's how a nation finds its way back to the light. I don't know how many years I have left, but I know this: I want to spend them being part of that light, because if we can find our way back to love, we can find our way back to each other. And maybe, just maybe, we can find our way back to God.